Welcome to Great Bay Community College and to today's session. This marks the final installment of this semester for Great Bay's Perspectives on Community Colloquium, which aims to provide space for diverse voices on matters relevant to our students and the greater community. More info on the colloquium can be found at greatbay.edu/perspectives on community colloquium with dashes between the words, or by simply going to Perspectives on Community Colloquium and Googling it. It's usually the first one that comes up. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Judge Margeurite Wageling, who was the first woman elected to be Hillsborough County Attorney, a position she held from 2004 to 2009, and has been an active member of the Judicial Selection Commission, the New Hampshire Child Advocacy Center, the Statewide Advisory Council, the Elliot Hospital Board of Directors, the New Hampshire Crime Commission, and the New Hampshire Elder Abuse Advisory Council, among many other positions and volunteer positions that she's held. She's a graduate of Franklin Pierce Law Center, now the UNH School of Law here in New Hampshire. And since 2009, she has been a justice of the New Hampshire Superior Court until her retirement last year. Today, she'll be sharing some of her many experiences in her varied career navigating modern law and politics. To better facilitate our speaker and her remarks, today we'll be keeping the audience muted throughout most of the session, and we ask that any questions that you have be sent via the chat function to the host moderators, and we will pass them on to our guest after they complete their remarks. However, at certain points, they will be open to questions which you may either respond to or not by unmuting through the chat function. You can also provide follow-up questions at that time as well if you have any after submitting yours through the chat function. Feel free, of course, to tender your questions at any time throughout the session, and we will hold them in a queue and make sure that they are offered at the appropriate time. I'd also like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded for the benefit of the college community and those who can't attend live. If you would prefer not to be recorded, you may turn off your device camera and remain muted during the session. Thank you very much, and with that, I pass it on now over to Judge Wageling.
Well, good morning or now afternoon to everybody. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you to Professor Fansler for inviting me. I wasn't really sure how to start my discussion with whoever chooses to engage. I thought possibly it would be helpful to bring us back and get a perspective of what was going on a little bit in the world as I began my career in the law in New Hampshire. I think sometimes we forget what the foundation was, and so I thought it might be helpful just to bring our memories back to what was going on in the world back in those days. So I started high school in 1972, which is forever ago, I know. And so in 1972, Dartmouth, as an example, allowed the first woman into its college environment. The Boston Marathon first allowed women to run in the marathon in 1972. Title IX came into law. The first female FBI agent was hired. Moving forward, when I graduated high school in 1975, Connecticut elected its first, across the country, the first female governor was elected. And in 1976, the military academies began allowing women to enroll. The Marines allowed women into their general regimen in 1977. I graduated college in 1979, and in 1980, I'm proud to tell you, as at the time registered Republican, the Republican Party renounced any support of the Equal Rights Amendment during that national convention. Sandra Day O'Connor was nominated and eventually put onto the US Supreme Court, the first female. The first woman went into space, Sally Ride. in Rhode Island, they elected the first female attorney general in 1984. And the first US attorney general was in 1993. By then, I had been a lawyer for approximately 8 years when that happened. And so it's in that environment that I was coming up through the ranks. I became a lawyer in 1984, in the fall of 84. I had arranged to, after I finished law school, travel the world a bit, so I didn't begin working until 1985. I will tell you that when I went interviewing for jobs, I was at times given courtesy interviews, later learning that, as an example, I had decided I wanted to be a prosecutor. There were very few females in law enforcement and prosecution in those days. And I was given courtesy interviews only because I had some background from my law school career. I had interned at prosecuting offices. So they gave me a courtesy interview, but no one would hire me. Women just weren't in that function at the time. I eventually got a job in a private firm. When I interviewed, it was all men, and they were men of the 40, 50-year-old range. They told me after they hired me that the only reason that they didn't offer me a job at the interview was because they had to go home and talk to their wives and, if you will, have a family meeting, each of them, to decide whether or not it would be appropriate to hire a female into their small law firm. After I worked there a few weeks, I started receiving sexual harassment from one of the members of the law firm. That particular person eventually stalked me and harassed me for months. Even after I left the employ of that firm, I didn't stay long there. My next job was at the Rockingham County Attorney's office. The county attorney at the time, who is now dead, Stephen J.C. Woods, hired me because it was a campaign pledge that he had made that he would hire a woman because there had never been a woman in the office. In fact, I had interviewed at that office before I got my first job. That was one of the many courtesy interviews I got. He hired me and then began immediately to sexually harass me. He would come into my office and fantasize about various things with females and tell me these stories. During my employ, he got a vasectomy. He told me all about his vasectomy. I didn't stay there long either. It was obviously very inappropriate. So inappropriate that all the men that I worked with, the assistant county attorneys, we had an agreement that they would not allow me to be alone in the office with the county attorney because of the behavior that he exhibited towards me. So that was the beginning of my career. I stayed around 4 months in that office, and I went over to the Hillsborough County Attorney's office, where I stayed for in excess of 15 years. My coworkers there treated me with respect, but I was still the only female in the office. And so I was with male police officers. There was one female local law enforcement officer at the Manchester Police Department, and I knew of one state police officer who was female, and all the rest of the people that I worked with were men. By that point, there was one female on the Superior Court, and one female on what at the time was called the District Court in New Hampshire. So I had at least a little bit of exposure to women in my environment that I could look to as mentors, and particularly Judge Delanus was a huge resource, huge and positive resource for me. She was amazing and professional and wonderful and treated me wonderfully. But while I worked there from 1985 through 2000, particularly the beginning years, over the time that I worked there, things changed. Judges would speak about my attire. If not me, as other women came into the office, they would comment if they thought the skirt had an inappropriate slit, or and if we wore pants to court. We weren't allowed to wear pants to court when I first began working. There were a few females working for the Attorney General at the time, but largely it was a male world. They would refer to me by my first name, judges would, while they referred to the men as attorney, whatever. Or I would be referred to as Missy or Sweetie or little lady. The police officers would try to override my decisions by going to the first assistant or the county attorney, because I certainly wasn't going to be allowed to be making an important decision on their case because I was a female. They also gave me all the rape cases because they didn't want to deal with them. And in part, I was hired for that position. Again, that was, that's one of the reasons I got hired, to do rape cases. And when I appeared before certain judges who were older, clearly treated differently in front of the court. One time I came downstairs from being in front of a certain judge, and I explained how the judge had ruled in my favor on a rather important legal issue. And one of my male coworkers said to me, "Marguerite, all you have to do in that courtroom is cross your legs a few times back and forth. You're going to get anything you want." That's the way that certain judges treated women. They, if you dressed in a female fashion and you were reasonably good looking, you were treated with kid gloves, but in a patronizing way. If you were, I'll use the term very loosely, butch, if you didn't play the game, if you didn't engage as a female, using your female charms to get what you wanted, you would be treated differently and not with the same favoritism that those of us, including myself, I played the part. I heard time and again comments such as, if I at all complained about the behavior of the judge or the opposing counsel or the police officers, you would hear comments such as, "Can't you take a joke?" And warned not to complain to the hierarchy, because if you did, you would be retaliated against and isolated. So you either accepted it and played along, or you wouldn't progress in your career. That's just the way it was. I will tell you that as time went on, there was less and less and less of it. More women came into law enforcement and prosecution roles, defense attorney. I remember vividly being in Judge Telenis's courtroom one day. The defense attorney was a female. There was a probation officer there who was a female. I obviously was a female, am a female, and the judge was a female. And she stopped us and she said, "I want you to look around," because it was her first time that she had ever been engaged in any activity in her courtroom where everybody was a female. And we all just stood for a moment and sort of sucked it in and smiled. So as time has gone on, I will tell you that I see much, much, much less of that behavior, but it persisted through my career. When I was county attorney, as Professor Fansler said, I was the first female Hillsborough County Attorney elected into that position. I was treated wonderfully by the court, the employees that I had, but I had to be before the state reps for my budget and for certain policy decisions that would be made on a county level. The county delegation consisted of well over 100 state reps in the state of New Hampshire. They hugged me, they kissed me, they held my hand. I had to engage with them in that way. If I pushed them off and didn't allow that engagement, I would have been treated very differently. And I watched that. I watched that from other county officials and how they treated them. It was absolutely amazing. And I held that position until 2009 when I became a judge. Since being a judge, I will tell you, I have never once felt any even remote gender issue, discrimination, inappropriate behavior from any of the litigants who have come before me. Well, I guess I'll take that back. Some of them have, some of the, not the lawyers, but the litigants, pro se litigants. I have never felt concern for any type of sexual harassment or inappropriate behavior. So that's been my journey. And I have to say that, change is hard for everybody. Change is hard for me. It's these institutions have been around for a long time, and to have women and women's perspectives come into play. I think women do generally think consistently with men, but I have noted over the course of my life and my career certain anomalies that women hold, I think, more often than men. And I will be proud to say I think women are more organized, women are more empathetic, and I think that they cooperate. They, generally speaking, and these are generalities, they cooperate more with each other, and they are more willing to have open dialogue. But I'm happy. I'm happy with the changes, and I am no worse for the wear. No, I withstood the behaviors. I learned from them. I learned who to trust and who not to trust, and who to stay away from, and was able to succeed in a career goal of becoming a judge. And having retired from that position, I guess I can say that, notwithstanding what I might have experienced in my younger years, it didn't take away from what I was able to achieve. So I am happy to answer questions or engage in a dialogue about this. I know that Andrew, you're here, and obviously we have people from the college that are present. So I open it up and welcome any comments or questions.
Thank you very much for a very candid accounting of your career and the difficulties that you went through. So I have a couple of questions that are starting to come in and that cropped up. You mentioned that things seemed to be getting better. I'm curious if you saw that as being a generational kind of thing, or if you saw growth or change of some kind within individuals. Was it just that sort of the dinosaurs, or whatever you want to call them, were aging out by the time things got better, and that people who had maybe seen female lawyers or eventually women on the bench for their entire careers were now more normalized to it?
I think I agree that it's the dinosaurs aging out and then being replaced by people who were more, it was much more common for them to see women in the workplace and to interact on a professional level. Even the coworkers that I had when I was in Hillsborough County, who treated me wonderfully. The males that I worked with there couldn't have been more professional and helpful to me in my career. But even with them, while they encouraged me to be around, at lunch and even in the after work activities, they would get together separately without me, let's say poker games or going to a ball game, and they would not invite me. And at one point I asked about that, why aren't why aren't I being invited? And they explained again, it was back to the wives. Well, if we invite you, Marguerite, we're going to have to invite our wives. And we don't want to invite our wives. We want to have a guys' night out. And you're one of the guys, but we can't invite you because if our wives find out, then we're going to have to invite them. So even with my contemporaries, while I was the younger, I was probably the youngest one in the office at the time. So, you know, they're 5-10 years older than me. Even that, if you will, generational difference, I'd expect that those conversations, I would bet, do not exist any longer. That women, that wives aren't ruling the homestead in that same way, or you know, we're just so interchangeable now that that behavior doesn't exist. So before I came on today, I did chat with some younger women who are in their 30s and early 40s coming up through the ranks, and you know, particularly those that have been in law enforcement. And what I've heard from them is that it's hard for them to distinguish whether or not they're being treated differently because they're a female or because they're younger. So, and particularly as it relates to law enforcement. So they don't find it as much with coworkers, you know, co-working professionals, but those who were prosecutors described that police officers would treat them differently, just in the way that they discussed anything with them, or they'd go over their head to get a male opinion, wouldn't be satisfied with their opinion.
I think it's so ironic, the way you've described a couple of times now the idea of having to ask permission of their wives, and you know, basically ceding that kind of some level of authority or of, you know, say in the matter to women, when what effectively they're doing is using that as an excuse to you know, exclude you. It's just so it's a bit, you know, it can be kind of hard to wrap your mind around that sort of those sorts of gymnastics in a sense. But you mentioned that in your opinion, women tend to be more willing to compromise, or in the sense of willing to come together and negotiate, to talk about things and find common ground in that sense. I'm wondering if you think there's that some of your experience was tempered by, or if you think that there's a connection there to the idea of being a prosecutor versus being potentially a public defendant or something along those lines.
I'm not sure if I understand your question. You know, I've seen that, and when I make that comment, it's through, you know, my whole career. So, you know, judging, or I was on Women's State Prison Citizen Advisory Committee, and you know, we would talk a lot about how to best assist inmates at the state prison as compared to the male state prison, and what are the needs of female incarcerated individuals, and when they're paroled out, and what are the differences. And you know, I personally just never really thought about women being different in any significant way. But people in the industry will tell you that women inmates are significantly different. They are, men tend to more stand alone, and when they get out of prison, they don't have the same concerns about housing security or employment, where women are more reliant on social dynamics, and often are in much more vulnerable positions relative to income and housing. and often go back into abusive situations because of that. So, generally speaking, what I've seen in my career from, all the different things I've done, if it's interacting with state reps or, just employees that I had working with public defenders who are male versus female, watching as a judge the females versus the males that come in front of me. And across the board, I think women tend to be more organized when they're in front of me as litigants, as attorney litigants. They tend to come prepared for court and a higher level of competence. And when I watch them interacting with opposing counsel, whether it's from the prosecutor side or the public defender side. But I'm talking generalities. Clearly, I have met men that far surpass women in terms of their preparation and organization and their ability to be empathetic and coordinate with others. That goes without saying. There's many men that I've worked with who are phenomenal. They're amazing, and I brought great joy to watch them. My favorite coworker, Judge, is a male, and I worked with him for quite a number of years. And amazing, hard worker, no exhibition of any gender bias, and organized and brilliant. So anyhow. Those are generalities.
Sure. Was there anything that brought you to prosecution rather than defense or civil law or something like that? Tell us about what how that part of the journey came about.
Sure. So much of life is happenstance. It's just right place, right time. I, as I said earlier on, how with great pride, how the Republican Party left the support of the Equal Rights Amendment. I was involved in the Republican Party as in high school. It was social. It had nothing to do with, we'll be honest, I don't know that if my friends happened to all go and work for a Democrat, I probably would have been a Democrat at the time, but it just happened that it was Republican. And I ended up being mentored by some people that had some significant roles in the Republican Party in the state of New Hampshire, and they saw potential in me. And one of them ended up becoming U.S. Attorney for the state of New Hampshire while I was in law school. So he contacted me one day and asked if I wanted to do a clerkship at the U.S. Attorney's office, which was a plum job to have. And back in those days, you could get paid and still get credit for the work you did. So I had no money. I put myself through college and law school, and I had to work to be able to support myself. So it was a win-win. And I didn't even take criminal law in law school. My plan was to go get a job in the civil world and make a bunch of money so that I could be independent and not have to be supported by a man. And I ended up getting this job at the U.S. Attorney's office and fell in love with that work. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do. Sadly, you don't get paid much when you're a public servant. So I had a nice long career of mediocre salary and but great passion. And but it was serendipitous that it just happened to come in, fall in my lap and then become a reality for me that, tides have changed, that the Rockingham County Attorney decided he needed a female to, as a campaign pledge, and for me to fill that role as the first female assistant county attorney in Rockingham County. It opened the door just because I was a female. So
Mhm. I was wondering actually, to sort of jump off of that, if you could tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming the county attorney, the actual county attorney. Did you experience or did you find yourself having to defend against accusations, or were there, of whatever sort of sexist remarks may or may not have been put forth, but as part of the campaign, or was it by that time your experience as an assistant county attorney, was that good enough to overcome some of that, it seemed, or what was some of your experience?
Again, unique situations. I had the county attorney who had been elected in 2003, in the fall of 2003, ended up resigning the position in January of 2004. So there was a special election. And actually, I take that back. It was 2002, the fall of 2002. So he had been county attorney for some months. There's more to that story, but it's not relevant. So he had announced at Thanksgiving that he was going to be resigning his position. So the county had a special election in January of 2004. And I was one of maybe 6 people who submitted an interest in becoming the county attorney. The state reps are the people who elect in Hillsborough County when there's a special need to fill a county attorney position. They elect the county attorney for the interim term. And so they did interviews of the candidates. I was the only female who had submitted an application. And this interview committee made a recommendation to the full delegation as to who they should vote for. They did not choose me. I was the only, no, I wasn't the only one. I was one of 2 that had experience in that office. But they instead recommended another gentleman who was, a wonderful, kind guy. But the night of the special election, we all had to give a speech, and they used one of the courtrooms at the county courthouse as the meeting place and where the speeches were to be given. And it was a courtroom that I had argued, presented cases in for 15 years. It was home to me, and I gave the speech of my career. I guess they gave me a standing ovation when it was done, and I didn't upset, and they elected me instead of the tall Tom Selleck-looking gentleman that they had recommended to the county delegation to elect. So I kind of pulled the rug out from under that and became the county attorney. So
Nice.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I'm wondering if you can speak to your view about the importance of having women represented, maybe even specifically on the bench, and simply what that can mean, both from the social, but also to some extent from like a legal perspective, in the sense of interpretation and representation in that way.
Well, I can tell you, as I was coming up through the ranks, having a female on the bench was important to me. It provided me with, an example of professionalism and so forth. I can't say that Judge Lanus, who was amazing, the first female of everything, first female on the Supreme Court, first Chief Justice female, she just was amazing and earned it all. It was a delight to have her there, and at times you could see maybe a slightly different perspective. Again, as time went on, when I first started, those, if you will, dinosaurs that were there, they held very different views as to what women, you know, even the way they treated cases. I had cases pulled away from juries because the judge decided that, you know, an example of a case I was prosecuting one day involved an arson. A gentleman and his wife were in the throes of getting divorced, and she was living in the family homestead, and he was mad and didn't want her to have the house. So he tried to burn it down while she was in there. And so he was charged with arson, and I was prosecuting the case, and I had, I was putting on a good case. It was clear that I was going to be successful in my prosecution of this gentleman, and the judge was not happy with that. And he pulled us into chambers, me and the male defense attorney, and he said to me, you know, what's this case about? What did he do that got his wife mad? Did he fish too much? And I thought, what is he talking about? And so I don't even remember how I answered the question, but he turned to the judge, turned to the defense attorney and said, she's killing you out there. He's going to get convicted. I'm not going to let this case go forward any longer. I'm going to take it from the jury. You tell your client that he'd better not pull something like this again. I'm going to put it on file without a finding. And if he comes back, I'm going to slam him, but that's what I'm doing. I'm pulling the case from the jury. And I couldn't stop the judge. So things like that, I don't think you'll see anything like that happening today, but things like that happened in those days back in the 80s. Females, I think there are currently seven female judges on the Superior Court. I just retired, so now actually there are still 7, because one of the women, Jackie Smith, was just confirmed as a new Superior Court judge. So there's 7 out of 21 on the Superior Court and 1 out of 5 on the Supreme Court. I think it's important. I equally, though, think it's important to have former public defenders. You know, in the old days, you couldn't get on the bench as a public defender. You'd have to be a prosecutor, plain and simple. Your career had to include being a prosecutor, or, you know, civil work, but not a public defender. And I think that was wrong, and I'm glad that that's changed. So I don't think it's solely, I know we're here to talk about gender, but it's not solely having females and males mixed in, but I think it's people from different walks of life. You know, people like me who put themselves through school and I didn't come up with any pedigree of lawyers, and I was the first in my family to go to law school, to get an advanced degree. And, you know, I had no connections, none, other than the self-made ones that I told you about from high school that I developed on my own. My family was not involved with politics. You know, we were lower middle class on the west side of Manchester. We knew nobody. We had no connections to anything. It was just the luck of the Irish that I happened to fall into certain groups of people, and it made a difference in my life.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I was wondering too. You mentioned when you were talking about being, I believe it was when you said being part of one of the early law firms, but it was earlier in your career, but that you were hired when they actually did hire you effectively so that you could handle basically female-based cases, and including, and particularly you mentioned the rape cases and things like that.
Yes.
And it just occurs to me that, you know, that would have also been a period in which cases like that weren't always taken perhaps as seriously. That might be the way to say it, as otherwise. And I think, and so assigning you to that, or a token female to that, seems like seems to confirm that, but also seems to be one of the reasons why that kind of thing might have changed. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more, or what else.
Sure. I was hired at the Hillsborough County Attorney's Office as part of a federal grant that they had been awarded. And actually it made sense at the time, even though, anyhow, it made sense at the time. But so the federal grant provided that they would need to have a seasoned prosecutor working as a team with a new prosecutor, bringing somebody in and training them. So, to have an experienced prosecutor helping teach a new prosecutor. So I filled the role of the new prosecutor. The seasoned prosecutor obviously was a man, because there weren't any females in the office. And then the grant also provided for the hiring of an investigator and a victim witness advocate. So it was the first in the state of New Hampshire. There's now victim witness advocates in every county court and at the Attorney General's office. But it started at the Hillsborough County Attorney's Office by way of this grant, where the federal government was providing funding to hopefully have people treat the cases more seriously. And it was child rape cases. So anybody under the age of 18 who was not just raped, assaulted, any physical assault or any sexual assault would funnel through this team that I was part of. So I was on that team for my first 2 years of working there. And so my full diet of cases was 95% were child rape cases, which are the most serious cases one could prosecute. So, even though it was sexist to put me in that position, it was the best experience a new attorney could ever have gotten, because I was in trial all the time, and I was in trial on the most serious cases, save murder, homicide cases done by the Attorney General's office. And I became an expert in that area of law, and really was sought after by the big law enforcement community. I got a reputation as someone who could try them well, and was largely successful. But you're right. You'd go into court with these cases. The laws have, respectfully, the majority by far of legislators and governors in our state have been men, and they're the ones that are writing the laws. And I'd like to tell you that the laws were all written fairly, but they weren't. And over time, they've adjusted, and we all make mistakes. So the legislature has ebbed and flowed in terms of trying new things and listening more intently to people in the community to effectuate laws that will do good for both sides of those kinds of cases. Not to put an unfair advantage on either side. And I was in the middle of that as that was playing out. It would be very common for me to be in a rape trial where the defense attorney would conjure up Salem witch trials. This is like Salem witch trial. How do you defend against these cases? And kids just not being believed. And so over time, the laws have changed. As an example, they in the 90s developed case legislation, and now we have case law, where you can prosecute a person for pattern sexual abuse. Because when you bring a person in who's been repeatedly sexually abused, normally we need to be able to prove a specific time frame when the crime occurred, a specific place where it occurred, and provide details to support that allegation. But if I asked you what you had for breakfast last Tuesday, you might not be able to tell me unless you eat the same thing for breakfast every day. But then if I asked you for specifics about that particular breakfast, what cup did you use and what bowl did you use, you wouldn't be able to tell me, because it happens all the time. And it's, you can't distinguish. Our brains just don't remember things that way. We don't imprint memory that way. And so the legislature heard and listened and accepted as real that they needed to adjust the law in New Hampshire to allow for what are called pattern abuse cases. And so that was a huge step in prosecuting the cases. And over time, I think the juries began to believe children and women. I have been involved with prostitute rape cases where prostitutes, using that term very loosely as well, have made allegations of sexual assault and have been believed. So I think our world is changing, and we're more accepting of. And I will also tell you, I prosecuted cases where there were false allegations, and ferreting those out is equally important to make sure that justice is done. So I'm not here to suggest for a second that all women only tell the truth about everything. That's not a reality.
So only have a couple more things. Thank you. You mentioned courtesy interviews and some things like that, and I'm curious how much of an open secret that kind of thing was. We're hearing about courtesy interviews in the news with much less important, like the NFL and things like that. You hear these sorts of terms get kicked around, but then as soon as you get this big splashy news article or story, it turns out that everybody knew somewhere along the line, or people claim to have. I'm wondering how you felt you knew, or if there were circumstances that simply made it obvious, or that or how much of an open secret it was that these things were, that this was a sham process to that extent for you.
Well, particularly, as an example, the Rockingham County Attorney's Office. I ended up getting hired there, as I said. The people that were my coworkers while I worked there, who I very much enjoyed, and other than the county attorney, were employed there when I interviewed there the first time around. And after I got the job, they told me about the sham interview. And that's what would happen, depending upon where I happened to be in my career. And I would have people in the know who later would tell me, everybody knew. Well, when I say everybody, not everybody, but people in the know knew that it was a sham. But they have, they're playing the game and fulfilling an obligation. It didn't happen, it certainly didn't happen a lot. I know of 2 times that it happened in my career, because I was told afterwards by people inside of the institution who told me, you did a fine job in the interview, they were never going to hire you, and this is why. But over time, as right before I became a judge, I was being sought after by private civil firms because I had developed a reputation in the Manchester community as a good administrator and a fair litigant. And so, even though they might not have, and the other thing the other overlay I will say is that I went to Franklin Pierce Law School, as you described, and I wasn't there when it first started, but I was in some of the earlier graduating classes, and New Hampshire was slower to accept people from Franklin Pierce Law Center as prospective employees. They were choosing to go to the Boston law schools for applicants. So, that played a part as well, I'm sure. And I don't think that exists much anymore. I think generally speaking, UNH law graduates are on an equal footing for most employers in the state of New Hampshire. So, but at the time it was hard, even for the top of our class at Franklin Pierce, to get interviews at some of the prime law firms in the state of New Hampshire, or to get into the Attorney General's office.
Thank you. I believe we have a question coming in directly from Andrew. Andrew, if you'd like to ask, by all means.
Well, sure. Well, thank you so much for taking my question and coming in and discussing these issues. I actually serve on the Hillsborough County delegation, so I kind of have a unique perspective and understanding of some of your experiences dealing with members of the delegation. I certainly haven't witnessed any behavior rising to that level during my time, but I can certainly understand the possibility of it due to the level of professionalism, or I guess lack thereof, from some of the state reps. I'm also shocked and angered by the situations where sexism and gender bias have seemingly affected the outcome of some criminal cases in New Hampshire. Is this something that seems to have occurred frequently back in the day, or was it more of a rarity?
It's hard for me to answer that. I vividly remember some of the more unique occurrences of that happening with, again, some of the older judges that were seated at the time. The newer judges didn't behave that way. There was much more transparency in terms of the handling of cases. But when you're trying rape cases, particularly, there were old school behaviors that were exhibited, at least at the initial stages of my career. I think that as people began treating the cases differently, particularly by that task force that I was involved with, as it relates to rape cases in the county, I think that the behavior fell away pretty quickly. But it did occur. I can't say that it happened a lot, but it happened. And even one case is too many. And I will say, as a judge for an excess of 10, 12 years, I never heard of stories such as that. I never, it just, I think the judges that are currently sitting are professional and apply the facts to the law. And I don't hear about cases like that anymore. But we're talking mid 80s. Life was just very different then. People just behaved differently than they do today. Thank God. But it happened.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm actually all out of our questions here. My final question or prompt, I guess, is simply to ask you if there's anything that you would like to share or mention as a final thought with us, or with anybody potentially watching on recording.
Well, I think to reaffirm what I said earlier, that notwithstanding the behaviors that I was exposed to over time, I, like most of us who have been subject to unusual behavior or discrimination of varying levels, we're tough, and while it's not acceptable or excusable behavior, you learn from it, and you learn how to treat people in the future, and how to find ways to convey that the behavior is not acceptable. I'd like to believe that I didn't encourage any of the behavior that was placed on me, but I'm subjectively looking at myself, and I even getting ready for this discussion, which is a rather personal one, to air this dirty laundry, if you will. I'm sure that I, at times, unwittingly, or maybe even wittingly, and I just don't choose to remember it now, allowed for the behavior and maybe even encouraged the behavior. I don't know, but we learned from it. We all learned from it on both sides, and I have tried my best as I continued in my career to act as professionally as I could, with the hope that people would treat me not based upon my gender, but treat me as a professional because of my ability and my dedication to whatever it was that I was engaged in at the time. And and largely, I think that that's what happened. I'm speaking of behaviors purposely in this discussion that provide examples of things that I was exposed to, but 85–95% of the time, this behavior didn't exist. People generally, my coworkers, as I said, treated me professionally, wonderfully, particularly in the workplace. I didn't have any issue with any of them. And the judges as well. So I think we all learn and we all grow and we all make mistakes, and hopefully because we learn from them, we're all better for it. So I hope that we continue to grow in our, with gender issues becoming in the forefront again because of developments and in society's viewing of gender and so forth. And that's evolving too. So,
are there is there any advice, any groups or organizations that you would point towards for potential young lawyers or students, pre-law students or somebody thinking about being a lawyer that you would that you would provide to try to move them in what you would consider to be the right direction, to have a successful career as you did?
Well, I think people often think that people in positions of power don't want to help other people come up through the ranks. And I think it's quite the opposite. I think generally speaking, people have no problem mentoring and assisting people, giving advice. And once in a while, people would reach out to me on the bench and ask to come and meet with me and talk. We used to get school groups in quite often in Stratford County, where I was assigned for a while, and then Rockingham County, and that's all fallen away. So I think it's a more re-engagement and taking away what people might perceive to have as barriers. Feel free to call up a judge, or call up the county attorney, or call up somebody at the AG's office and ask to meet with them and ask for advice. I think you'd be surprised at how many doors swing wide open. I think people are intimidated to ask, but generally speaking, people like to help. And so I would encourage people to not hesitate to reach out to the judicial branch or people in the executive branch to get advice and to ask for help. There is a mentoring program through the New Hampshire Bar Association. But I think that's more for lawyers that are already admitted. So I off the top of my head, I can't, I don't know. I don't have any memory of a specific organization that's out there. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
No, that's all right. That was perfectly that's entirely in line with the spirit of the question. And I think that is great advice. not simply in legal fields, but all around, is that there, and a hopeful note to end on. There are people who are willing to help. There are people simply reach out that are willing to give advice. And on that note, then, I want to say thank you again to Judge Margeurite Wageling. I want to say thank you to all who attended, and to Great Bay Community College for hosting. And yet again, thank you for a really engaging and interesting and thought-provoking conversation, a very candid discussion. Judge Wageling, thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Yes, have a good afternoon as we are now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.